Hello, I'm Irvin Student. Welcome to Global Brief Winter Spring 2014 issue. Beautiful issue in front of you. Again, thanks for your support. We are honored today in Global Brief Studios in Toronto to have my friend and colleague Douglas Sanderson from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Douglas, thanks for coming to Global Brief.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for your terrific piece in the last issue of Global Brief. Finally, we were able to get you in studio. I want to talk about it because it's become a bit of a classic in Global Brief, read nationally and internationally, and it's about Aboriginal grand strategy. I wonder whether you could walk our readers through some of the basic arguments.
Sure, thanks. So I think the basic idea is that settler people and people in general, I think, have short memories. And First Nations people had, for many, many centuries here in Turtle Island, a sophisticated way of working through their issues through national and international diplomacy. And it was into that world that the very earliest settler people walked. And for many centuries, for 3 centuries, Wampum diplomacy was the way that settler and indigenous people came to understandings and came to sign treaties and came to work together. After the early 19th century, First Nations people begin then to settle into the background. They're sort of pushed aside, and wampum diplomacy disappears. Residential schools come on the scene, the Indian Act arises. But in the past decade or 20 years, First Nations interests have really come to be supported by the courts and increasingly, with Idle No More, by the population at large, as people come to understand that First Nations' rights in land and their territories are real legal rights. And First Nations are not adrift with this new power. It's a sense of power that is aligned with the way First Nations have always conducted themselves in national and international diplomacy. And so the piece is about the way the world is being reordered along the lines of how Indigenous people have always ordered themselves in their relationships with others.
That's terrific. So wampum diplomacy, if you explain that to our readers, and then also what are the implications of this way of doing business and diplomacy for modern diplomacy for states in the 21st century?
So wampum diplomacy was a system of diplomatic relations that was very complex and highly regulated, and it involved the articulation of honesty and respect for one another. It involved the giving of gifts and the passing of wampum strings, which were originally quahog shells on beads, and later they became beads, strung together, and as people spoke, they would be required, in order to affirm the truth of their statements, to pass strings of beads to one another. So there'd be long rituals where people were required to prove what they were saying through the giving of gifts. Nothing could really get done under the old order, under the wampum diplomacy order, without hundreds of belts and strings of beads being passed as a way of ritualizing contact between treaty negotiators. So wampum diplomacy is a uniquely sort of northeastern coast and up into Ontario in parts. Across the prairies, there were pipe ceremony protocols that would regulate those agreements. And into the West Coast, there'll still be other forms of these diplomatic agreements. The point is, I think, not the specific form, whether it's wampum or pipe or potlatch ceremonies. The point is that First Nations have a system of regulating their contacts with others, and it is increasingly becoming incumbent upon national and international actors to go to the communities, to learn those rituals and those ceremonies, and to conduct negotiations, whether they're for territorial issues or for resource-based issues, in order to gain an understanding of what the First Nations community is saying, how they want to conduct the development, if it's a development that we're talking about, and how the First Nation understands its relationship both to national and international actors.
I think, and we were just discussing this before the interview today, people in Canada and indeed in other states with large First Nations Aboriginal populations tend to look at Aboriginal actors, Aboriginal peoples as internal actors rather than ones that have strategic consequence, indeed international consequence for the health of and welfare of the states and indeed their ability to achieve their interests. I wonder, there are two things. One, I wonder whether you could walk us through your this concept of radical federalism that you've been working on, some of the early thoughts that you've got on. And secondly, how do you foresee this interaction between governments in advanced states like Canada and First Nations peoples, Aboriginal peoples, in terms of the capacity to advance international interests in the 21st century?
So thanks. That's a great but a big question. But in a very quick way, most of resource development has been conducted on the assumption that international investors have secure property rights and property interests within the country that they are operating. But what we see with the rise of First Nations communities, with the assertion of their Section 35 rights, with the duty to consult and accommodate, legal doctrines that govern the way actors can participate in First Nations territories, it's increasingly not the case that foreign investors can just presume that if they get the permits, everything will be fine. First Nations have a massive role in articulating their views in media and social media, their protests. They can shut down developments that are often in very, very remote territories where First Nations are by far the majority of the population. And this in a country that's very, very large and is strung together over very, very remote areas where infrastructure is not secure in the way that international actors always presume that it can be secure. So part of the role that I think international actors have to understand when they work in countries like Canada now is that there is a national government that has a permitting regime, but there's also a set of local actors who are able to exert their power over the territory itself. And that means that they must be involved in the process, not just of the permitting, but in the obtaining of permission to operate in the territories for a price, and a price that First Nations are willing to negotiate. You asked about federalism, and so I think what we're seeing in this, with this rise, with this articulation of First Nations power, is a sense that jurisdiction over First Nations territories, which has been largely allotted to the federal or the provincial government, is no longer acted upon in that way, that there is another order that is exerting their own jurisdiction, First Nations jurisdiction, over their own territories, in as much as they're able to allow or deny or stymie development in their territories. They're exerting a form of jurisdictional power. And I think it's interesting to think about a world not too far in the future where we recognize First Nations in vast swaths of the Canadian territory as jurisdictional actors who would have power over development that would be not just a de facto power, but a power that's written into the Constitution itself. I mean, I think in the South, I don't think a lot of people care whether it's First Nations actors who are tariffing and taxing resource development and paying that money into a fiscal formula in the way that Ontario does when mines open in Northern Ontario. If you're in the South, the same amount of money is flowing in.
In the United States?
Oh, no, in Canada.
In Canada,
so if you're in Toronto or Calgary, I don't think it really matters to you if it's a First Nation government that is taxing development and then paying that money into federalism in the same way that a province does. The same amount of money is flowing in. But First Nations actors then are exercising jurisdiction in their communities, and they're able to pay for the development of their own community. So they're able to achieve the kind of economic independence that many, many people desire to see in First Nations communities. So this is a new way of thinking through federalism, where First Nations actors aren't wards of the state. They're not governed entirely by the federal government or provincial actors, where they're their own level of government and have their own independent authorities and powers.
That's great. Just one last question. This goes to a piece that I've got in the current issue of Global Brief, which is inspired by a lot of our discussion, and that is, if you make First Nations or Aboriginal peoples in some cases properly responsible for jurisdictional areas, constitutionally speaking in Canada, would this play a role of politically resuscitating, as it were, Aboriginal peoples in ways that we see, for instance, in New Zealand with the Maori, where they're political co-equals in governance with the otherwise the white majority, the Anglo-Saxon European majority, and therefore have better socioeconomic outcomes in general?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's right. I think that First Nations people have become sort of economic wards of the state, in that they are unable to gain any of the benefits from their territories. But where we see a world where First Nations are economic actors, who are able to behave like provinces and like the federal government, exercising control over their territories, they're able to build communities in their own image, communities that reflect and underlie their own values. And those values are a part of Canadian history. They're a part that children read about in books and think. There's a reason why cowboy and Indian movies are popular. It's because the Indians are not always the bad guys. There's a sense of nobility and strength that underlay the earliest of the treaty relationships, that Indian actors were understood to be equals with the settler people. And that can come again, but it requires a world where Indigenous people, First Nations people, have economic control over their territories, where they're exercising political control over the development of their communities, and where they can once again stand proud in their traditions as co-equals with the settler people. And that's an end result I think that we can all be proud of.
Douglas, thanks for taking the time to visit us, and hope to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much.